welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the latest wave of disruption that COVID is wreaking upon our musical lives. Then we'll discuss the profession of music librarianship. And finally, we'll talk with author and composer John Swafford about his recent biography of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Tiffany, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Listening Limbo. In this game, I will name a category of works, say, for example, Beethoven symphonies, and our contestants will wager the amount of listening time they think it would take them to identify a piece in that category. After the wagers are in, they'll each hear their clip for the amount of time they've specified, and the contestant with the correct answer in the shorter amount of time wins the round. You guys ready to play?
Oh, yeah. Head to head.
Okay. Our first category today is, I'm actually surprised that we haven't done it already, Mahler symphonies. How are we feeling?
Iffy.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I feel like this totally plays to your strengths more than it does to mine.
It's only because I don't know 7 at all. Like, I think I've heard it once, and it's awesome. A complete void in my Mahler listening. And then there are a bunch of sections of Mahler that sound like other sections of Mahler. So
you don't say.
It's not one of those things that you can do like 2 seconds and be like, yeah, I definitely know. You could definitely swing and miss here.
Well, he wrote 9, and they are all known for being long. So
that's right. That's
why I'm starting off with this category rather than ending with it. I flipped a coin, and Will is going to start the bidding.
All right. I'm going to bid kind of high on this. I think I'll go with 8 seconds.
I like it. I'm going 7.
I figured you would.
Okay. Kensho has muted himself, and we have Will here for his 8 seconds of a Mahler symphony.
Okay, it's not one that I'm super familiar with. It's jaunty, woodwindy. It's not the first, not the second. I don't think Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the 4th symphony.
Well, this is the end of the third movement. Sorry, it's not the end of the third movement, but it's the middle of the third movement of Mahler 3.
Oh, the third, yeah. Okay, so that's one that I really don't know very well. If I had heard little kids doing Bing Bong, I would have gotten a second, but, no such luck. Yeah. All right, well, I just swing and a miss. If I had spent more time just talking it out, it wouldn't have helped me at all.
Fair enough. Okay. Let's get Kensho back in here for his 7 seconds of Mahler Symphony.
Hi,
Kensho. So we had a swing and a miss from Will. Let's see if you do any better with your 7 seconds. Here we go.
It's not 1, it's not 4, it's not 5. I don't think it's 6. 2. Instinctually, I want to say 7 because I don't recognize it immediately, and it's the one that's the hole. But maybe that is the trap here. Fuck it, 7.
Kensho, this is the third movement of 3.
I really wanted to say 3. God damn it.
Which is,
Should not have stepped in the trap.
Well, you ascribe a level of deviousness which I do not have because I didn't know which Mahler symphonies you didn't know. I mean, this is one of my favorite movements in all 9 of the symphonies. So in number 3, each one of the movements has a kind of subtitle of like what the blank tells me. So there's like what love tells me, which is the famous last movement, and so on. So this one is what the animals tell me, and it has like the most awesome ending. Like it's like triumphant blazing Mahler, maybe like the finale of the first symphony. Okay, second round here is going to focus on a genre, piano quintets.
Okay, another one that I can't say I'm particularly strong on. Let's see. Who are the big writers of piano quintets, Kensho? I mean...
I'm not giving you that information.
Brahms, Dvorak, not Beethoven, not Mozart. I mean, this is a romantic genre. They were writing piano trios and quartets maybe in the classical era, but Schumann and I don't know what are some of our other options here.
Shostakovich.
Schnittke.
If it's Schnittke, I will hand it to you.
I hope it's Schnittke. I hope so hard it's Schnittke. That's actually one of my favorite pieces by him. It's pretty cool.
I think you've mentioned it many times.
It has a solo for the pedal.
That I did not know.
It's actually a very depressing bit of the piece.
Pun intended there.
Yeah. Very nice.
Oh, very good. I really like this genre of work. I feel like all the examples are ones that like really demonstrate their composers' personalities, and there's not that many of them, right? Piano quintet generally meaning piano plus string quartet.
Right.
And so it's a pretty iconoclastic and like exemplary, by which I mean like the genre demonstrates the composer's personality genre. That's why I picked it. So, okay, here we go. Let's wager. Kensho, you're up.
4 seconds.
Okay, I'll let you eat that. I'm going to bet 5. Actually, I'm going to bet. What am I doing? Well, just 7 seconds.
Wait, it's usually just 1 second more, right? Isn't that how it works?
Yeah, you can bet whatever you want to.
Wait, no,
I'm
no.
not trying to defend my honor here. I have no honor. I mean, I have enough honor not to do 10 seconds, although that's stupid. Why not? I'm just going to do 10 seconds. 10 seconds.
Well, you're just completely classless. That's fine.
Yeah, well, have fun with your 4 seconds. Good luck.
Right. And goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, Kensho. All right, here are all 10 seconds of your piano quintet.
That's got to be Shostakovich.
You got it.
All right, yeah, glad I had not much piano in that excerpt of a piano quintet, but at the end we got it there. So, but Kensho, I don't think we'll get to hear that, which is very nice.
Okay.
Okay, so Will did indeed guess correctly.
Well, duh, after 10 seconds, geez, one would expect.
Here we go with your 4 seconds of a piano quintet.
Shostakovich.
Very good.
Wow,
all right.
Very nice.
Have you played it, Kensho?
I have. It's a fun one.
It's a really fun one. Okay, very good. 1 point to Kensho. Here we are in round 3.
I can really squeeze Will here. This is
well,
good.
okay, so I don't know if you guys probably didn't have the same childhood I had, but we dumped a little bit on Mickey Mouse a couple of weeks ago, and I was putting together a program this week. The category is, and you are not allowed to look this up, music from Fantasia.
I love it.
Music from Fantasia. Very nice.
Which one?
Yeah, are we just the original Fantasia or the canon
original.
of Fantasia? Okay, the original.
I debated a bit on whether to go broad but let's say the first Fantasia, the OG.
All right. I don't want to talk through the.
Oh yeah, tell. Well, what do you?
Yeah.
What,
No.
what are
I'm not
selections
doing the pregame.
Did you guys watch this growing up?
Oh yeah.
You were so willing to share information earlier. What's going on now?
Let's be honest. I mean, the Fantasia, it's really familiar favorites. Many of them made extremely familiar by the fact that they were in the original Fantasia.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we need to spark our memory of the repertoire by listing it out here.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so it's my bet. I'm going to go 3 seconds.
That's what I was going to bet. Okay. Yeah, I mean, at worst we tie, which is disgusting to me, but yeah, I'll go 4. I'll let you go second for once.
Fine.
And notice that I'm saying 4 and instead of 10 seconds.
Well, good for you.
Just want that to be noted, Christopher. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Bye, Will.
Bye.
4 seconds of a selection from Fantasia.
Oh, yeah. Oh, what is this? Oh, is it Ponchielli Dance of the Hours?
It is.
Woo! Oh, but you know what? Will is going to get this so easily. Oh, I should have done. Oh, no. Oh, well. I'll take a tie. God.
All right. Will, let's get Will back in here. Kensho, after some agonizing, did come up with the correct answer.
Oh, boy. Uh-oh.
Here we are. 3 seconds of a selection from Disney's Fantasia.
Gosh, it sounds so much like Verdi, but I don't think that there's any Verdi in Fantasia. I have a different guess, and I don't really know if this is in there either, but I think it is. I think that this might be The Dance of the Hours by Ponchielli.
I'm there. Good for you.
Thank you.
So you jump up. This is the dancing hippos. It's the best thing.
Okay.
Is there anything more iconic than a hippo in a tutu? Anyway,
No.
The answer is no. Good round, guys. So 1-1. I guess that's a tie. I mean, sometimes we traditionally make the last round worth more points, but
No, not in this game.
No, thank you.
No.
Yeah.
If anything, I should win since Will took 10 seconds on that second answer.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds. So we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
As a general rule, for our first topic on the Gabfest, we like to discuss a recent news item from the world of classical music. And what has been dominating the headlines in our industry once again? That's right, it's the virus known as SARS-CoV-2, now in its latest iteration, the highly transmissible Omicron variant. Though the variant seems to pose significantly less risk to individuals who are vaccinated and boosted, the sheer prevalence of the virus, even among highly vaccinated populations, is straining the capacity of hospital systems, keeping adults and children from school and work, and canceling concerts and shuttering theaters throughout the globe. I hasten to add that for those who cannot be vaccinated and the immunocompromised, this is not so much another wave of inconvenience, but the continuation of a truly perilous years-long reality. I'm sure we'll all have many anecdotes to share, but I'll start off with one particular news story that had a bit of a happy twist. The San Francisco Chronicle reports that the San Francisco Symphony had to cancel a matinee concert on Thursday, January 13th at the last minute when several members of the orchestra turned up positive for COVID, but that the show did in fact go on. Pianist Jan Lisiecki, who was to have performed Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto with the orchestra, instead delighted the audience with an hour-long recital of Chopin. So that's one slightly happy news story, but obviously not happy for the orchestra members who came down with COVID, although as far as we know, they could have been totally asymptomatic. I mean, one thing that's going on right now is that orchestras and theaters are regularly testing all of their members before they go on stage, which seems like a very sensible idea to me. Something very similar happened here in Seattle a week and a half ago. I was actually on the bus heading downtown. It was like 6:30. I was going for an 8 o'clock show, and we got an email that they had canceled because of something just like this. You know, their rapid tests were due at 5 o'clock, and by 5:30, they knew that they had some people who were testing positive. Have you guys run into this yet in the latest round of Omicron? Kensho, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, in December, I was supposed to go to Japan for some performances of Beethoven 9. And there, the performances themselves weren't canceled. It was just that the Japanese government shut off any entry through their borders. So I actually just couldn't get in. The performances went ahead as scheduled with another conductor. But, you know, there was a lot of paperwork in place already to try to get in with COVID tests and all that, like any other country that you travel to. But once the government decided to shut everything off, I was unable to go. And then just a few weeks ago, I was supposed to be at the Met doing some workshops for a new opera, and that also got postponed until July for obvious reasons. So yeah, there's a little bit of just schedules moving around right now, obviously all understandable given the situation, but you know, it's frustrating sometimes.
Tiff, have you run into many speed bumps with this latest wave of COVID?
Not in my personal career.
Mm-hmm.
We in the academic sphere are, I guess in this case, blessed to already have a model that we had to come up with during the pandemic months that we continue to revisit at the beginning of every semester, certainly, but also intermittently with all the cases on campus. So we are still able to accomplish our mission on Zoom. That's fine. I guess what we're looking at here is like, should organizations that obviously, you know, perform for-profit concerts, what is the right approach here? Because I admit to some skepticism, eye-rolling, recently seeing multiple orchestras, for example, with like belly-up wind sections, like the entire wind section is decimated due to COVID, and the orchestra, rather than cancel the concert, in fact, flies in musicians from literally across the country. I have multiple data points on this in the last month. And it's like, not helping? But on the other hand, what's an orchestra to do? Is it better to cancel? We're on our merry-go-round again.
Yeah, we really are. Because, it's like if you know that somebody has... you can't in good conscience put somebody on stage that has COVID. And like in the case of the Seattle Symphony concert that I was going to go to, apparently there's a husband and wife who are the principal horn and the violist and a member of the viola section. And the viola section person had turned up positive for COVID. I don't know about the horn player, but they live together, so obviously there's a high level of exposure, and you especially can't put somebody on stage who is a wind or brass player if you know that they've likely have COVID. And then if your principal horn player 2 hours before the concert's supposed to start can't play, like this was a very complicated program of all John Adams music, like you can't just like sub somebody in to sight read that on zero notice. So this definitely has to happen. Just a word about the testing protocols. I was reading an article about actually a theater in Olney, Maryland. Let me read this quote. For Olney, which had 2 hugely successful musicals running when Omicron surged last month, the costs were catastrophic. COVID testing alone, a service that all professional theaters are now required to provide under guidelines from the Actors Equity Association, currently costs only an average of $30,000 each month. So, like my organization, we're now testing our wind and brass players. I just put in a big order of tests. 160 tests costs over $2,000. And as we all know, in the United States, heretofore, the government has not offered any assistance with the testing price. Our test price is higher, as far as I know, than it is anywhere else in the world, certainly than it is in a lot of our peer countries in Europe. And now the Biden administration has said that they are going to step in and offer a certain number of tests to individuals, but I don't know if either of you have seen anything about this. Is there going to be any price offset for organizations, especially entertainment companies, about subsidizing the cost of our testing? Because we're ones who really need it at an institutional level, and I haven't seen anything about that. Have either of you?
No, in fact, I feel like this is very much a number of arts organizations are going to take this move as permission to offload the cost of testing onto the individuals, right? So like, because this is now being publicly supported, now we don't have to buy batch tests as an organization. And
unfortunately, it's not nearly enough. Because I think what is it, that each family gets something like 4 tests a month?
No.
What is it?
Every individual can get 8 tests per month.
I see. But if an individual can only get 8 tests, if you're a professional orchestral musician, or even somebody who's doing more than 8 rehearsals or performances a month, that's not enough to test before every single time.
Yeah, but even at the height of the pandemic, most orchestras were testing maybe 3 times a week. That was a fair frequency for organizations to be testing their members.
Well, for PCR tests, but now I think the expectation is that they're, like, for example, I just know from friends who play in the Seattle Symphony that they're supposed to do a rapid test before every service, and so for an average week of an orchestral musician, that's like 7 services a week. That
doesn't work, yeah.
So there's your 8 tests a month basically right there.
Obviously this is not the time for this, but there is going to be a time in which the numbers are not as bad, the hospitals are not taxed, where they're gone. At this point, it is an endemic where we're going to have to deal with it on some level. Where are we going to draw the line where we say, like, okay, well, we don't shut everything off because someone tests positive, which seems like a completely crazy idea right now.
No, I think that time is right now. A lot of orchestras are in fact not canceling concerts. Like I said, many orchestras are flying musicians across the country rather than cancel their concert, despite many positive incidences in orchestra and frankly, the extreme likelihood that there will have been a positive person in orchestra at a rehearsal at some point in the last week. But of course, we're no longer receiving advice to quarantine. I think what we are seeing right now is evidence of the fact that people are not willing to shut down all the way again.
Yeah, but I think what I'm referring to right now is I think that there's still generally, for the most part, people are kind of in freak out mode whenever somebody tests positive, and at some point we're going to be less so about this, right?
Yeah. What's it like in Europe? Kensho, do you have a sense of, are concerts going on? Are they getting canceled a lot? What's happening?
There's a little bit of adjusting going on right now where maybe there was something that was planned with chorus is now no longer with chorus, or slight adjustments. I don't see any concerts being canceled, but there are definitely program adjustments that are happening. And I think we can expect more of that as we go forward, at least for this wave, not knowing when it's going to crest. I think this is going to happen for another few weeks.
Well, I guess I'll just close this segment by saying, one, we certainly hope that this wave does peak and decay as fast as everybody's saying that it's going to. And two, we're a classical music podcast, so obviously we're just talking about how this affects our lives, but I do know that it affects, real people's lives in much more dire ways than just canceling concerts. So we do want to show our respect and our best wishes for everybody who is affected by this. But yeah, this is really the story of our times, and it affects us too professionally. And, it seems like there's not much appetite for shutting down and financially supporting institutions in the wave of said shutdown. So I guess we're just muddling through once again. All right. With that, on to our second topic, Kensho.
On last week's episode, in which we discussed the new book of children's poetry, A is for Oboe, we pointed out that there was a page devoted to music librarians, a decidedly obscure choice for a children's book. However, we did not mean to throw shade on the profession of music librarianship. We love music librarians. Prompted by a video sent in from listener Jeremy, that listener Jeremy?
Yes, that listener Jeremy.
Goodness. We wanted to devote a segment to these wonderful people. Let's hear a clip from this video.
This is Lyrics Music Library, where we house more than 10,000 scores by countless composers. Most operas require somewhere around 60 orchestra parts to be prepared for strings, winds, on and off-stage instruments called banda, and more. But for a big production like Strauss, Der Rosenkavalier, we provide music to 80 musicians in the pit, 22 banda musicians plus the chorus. And what would a library be without a librarian? Ciao Annika!
Hi Maestro!
Years before an opera is seen on stage, performance librarians, who are all musicians in their own right, work with directors, conductors.
So I thought we could launch the discussion about some of the responsibilities that librarians have, because from the audience viewpoint, I think their only contact visually with the librarian is the person that brings out the score, or like changes the score on the conductor's stand and then leaves the stage. And sometimes people get that kind of ironic like applause as they're going off or whatever, which is always super awkward. Mm-hmm. So let's discuss a little bit like what are some of the main responsibilities behind the scenes that librarians are tasked with.
Well, I mean, for one thing, they literally manage a library, so like in a big orchestra, a big professional orchestra, for example, you've got a collection of pieces of music. So, you've got Beethoven's 7th Symphony, right? There's a box that has all of the parts for the violins and the cellos and the oboes and the bassoons. And they are going to see to it that collection of parts is cataloged and organized, and it's on the shelf where it's supposed to be. And when it's time to play Beethoven's 7th Symphony again, they're going to take it down from its appointed spot on the shelf, and they're going to review, make sure that everything is inside that's supposed to be, and then they are potentially going to make emendations on the face of the music, like the conductor or the concertmaster or one of the principal string players might have changed the bowings, and maybe we can talk about more what that means. And so they're going to copy those changes into all the different parts, and then they're going to make sure that the players find those parts in their folders, and that those folders get onto the stage, and then they're going to collect everything at the end, make sure that they've got everything they need. And so that's one, like the most basic responsibility, I would say.
And that necessarily won't be the only set of Beethoven 7 that librarian has to look after, because sometimes there's a whole another set of music director specific sets, and then there's another set dedicated to guest conductors, so that the music director set doesn't get tampered with other changes in the parts. So multiple versions of symphonies as well have to be taken care of.
That's right. With a really popular piece like that, of course, and especially then because, like, if it's an orchestra that's been around for a while, of course they would have bought Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, for the first time in like 1925, and then there's like new editions, which we've talked about in our copyright thing. There's new scholarships, so then there's new editions, so then everybody wants the fancy new edition. So yeah, I mean, a very popular piece at a big orchestra, you might have 5, 6, 7, up to 10 different copies of it, and the music librarians have to keep track of all of that.
We may as well acknowledge that librarian, when you're trying to become a conductor, there's any number of errant jobs that you might end up doing. And so, I mean, I don't know what your, Kensho, how much you've done, but like, I know Will, and certainly I've spent many hundreds of hours, right? Like doing the work of music librarianship. And it might be worthwhile. I mean, this video is adorable because it starts with like the guy coming up and being like, "Shh, we're going to enter a library today." It's not really the same as librarian in the sense that, the public sphere is kind of acquainted with this job, right? I mean, there's no managing of a space in which other people are going to come and work, for example. There's not generally the expectation, although this can be done, but it is not generally the purview of a music librarian to have a catalog available for public perusal so that people can come in and check out materials, right? That's not generally how music libraries work. It is expressly an operations based to support the operations of a symphony orchestra, generally speaking. And, there are such things as chamber music libraries, and those function much more like traditional libraries. But generally speaking, when we say music librarian, we do mean somebody that's attached to a symphony orchestra and somebody who does all of the very specialized work in supporting that ensemble specifically.
And I'll just point out that choirs also have librarians and, oftentimes voluminous amounts of music to keep track of as well. Mm-hmm. The responsibilities are a little bit different, but it's definitely, it's a big job as well. And a music librarian, no matter what kind of organization you're at, can make your life much, much, much easier. Or if you piss them off, they can make your life a living hell.
Yeah, I think like all three of us, like the appreciation comes from the fact that we've worked with librarians, and also we've done some of the work, a little, chunk of the work that, the massive amount of work that librarians do. And so we kind of are familiar with what we have to do. Do you guys have some like funny stories or anecdotes about your time working in a library for some reason or another?
Oh, God. Where do I start?
I have one. We can start off. We were premiering a new arrangement of a Brahms organ, interludes, I guess he wrote. Anyways, it was an orchestral transcription. And it was a world premiere of this. And I won't mention the publisher. Well, we just bleep out the first word of the publisher, and Hawks. Yeah. And the parts showed up the first day, and there was a massive transposing error. Mm-hmm. Where none of the winds and transposing brass were in the right key. So, of course, this was a turnaround of like maybe 12 hours for the next rehearsal. So I had to go through, get the original organ part and go through every single part to make sure that all the notes were correct.
That's a really good point, though, Kensho, is that librarians are also the first line of defense against defective music, especially new music or arrangements, pops, all kinds of stuff where, stuff can go wrong all the time. Music librarians are musicians. I mean, we should say that first. And in many symphony orchestras, they're actually members of the musicians' union. They have very keen eyes. It's not just like a mechanical thing of like copying what a down bow looks like and not knowing what it means. I mean, these people really understand how to read and interpret music.
Well, you have to audition for your spot. It's not like it's just like auditioning for a principal seat in an orchestra, right? There's a lot of, I don't know what goes into specifically a librarian audition. Do you guys know? Have you auditioned a librarian before? I have not, so I don't know. I'm not privy to this.
I have applied for librarian positions before, so I have the list of things that they required from me in the first round. But before I even get to that, I actually do have a funny story that's not mine. It's somebody else's, but it does demonstrate how specialized the knowledge that a music librarian has. I had a friend who, was a brass player, doesn't really do a lot of bowings, but was working in a music library for a music festival and got the masters very diligently, loyally copied out every single up and down bow. Did not know that bowings include slurs.
Oh dear.
All of Mahler 5, every up bow and down bow meticulously copied, not a single slur. And for those who are not string players, Up bows and down bows demonstrate which notes go inside one bow as it goes up or down. And so it is important to note that, when we have an arc across several notes, it generally means that all of those notes should go in the same directionality of the bow. And so if you do not copy those arcs, which we call slurs, then you are fundamentally changing the bow, in effect rendering all of your pretty ups and downs, the symbols that actually mean up and down, for naught. So there's a whole vocabulary that goes in when you have to do bowings. But anyway, the entire Mahler symphony, and like we just went through today, Mahler symphonies are very long.
Yeah.
So in having applied to a librarian position, I think what I was asked to provide in the second round was something like a knowledge of a couple different editions of like Dvorak 9 and, like bow this for me, it was like that kind of stuff. I didn't advance, so I don't know, deeper in like what an in-person audition would have entailed, but it's things like that. And one thing that I have found to be fairly specialized is the knowledge of how rental companies work, right? So I think we might get into that as well. I mean, there's portals through which you have to go to order music that is not in the public domain, which we have covered on this show. And getting that is a whole bag of worms, right? I mean, it's like Kensho says, like, they might come and suddenly your conductor wants to change every single bowing in the part and you're stuck doing this overnight. Do you guys have any like stories about rental or, insight about rental music that you guys want to share?
Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, and that's a really good point, is that, that's part of the institutional knowledge that these people have to have, is like, who are the various publishers? Who publishes what piece? If it's some obscure piece, they're going to have to like hunt it down, whether it be a rental or a purchase that they can make. Oh, yeah. I mean, the stories I could tell you from when I was assistant conductor in Cincinnati about our, intrepid library team having to deal with things on such short notice and like do spectacular feats of editing, sort of the type of thing that Kensho was talking about. And conductors who were total procrastinators showed up and then expected the whole world to revolve around them. I won't name any names, but maybe there's one that starts with a J and rhymes with Dames Conlon. Just really the kind of somersaults that these people had to do, and did it totally professionally and without a peep, except for maybe behind the scenes to people who are also dealing with this stress.
This brings to mind two other things that I think we ought to mention. One, that I think mostly industry insiders only would know, that the easiest concerts for the musicians are often the most work for librarians, which I mean pops concerts. Concerts
right.
with many selections on them,
right.
where there are maybe 20 different selections sourced from, many of them sourced from rental companies that are all of a sudden coming in, and like that's why folders for these concerts, the concerts that y'all kind of go to and like are chill and they're fun and you just kick back and relax, those are often the hardest for the operations and library teams to put together, one. And two, those are also the concerts that are likeliest to involve something that can be an extremely taxing thing for a librarian, which is to put in cuts, which is what are mentioned in that poetry book that we covered, right? X is for cuts. So sometimes, for these concerts, the approach is a little bit more casual. I mean, you're not generally going to make a cut in a Beethoven symphony, but it's very possible that you might make a cut in Harry Potter to get the right 4 minutes of themes in that will kind of float your audience's boats. And getting that cut to look correct and to go from, you have to tape pages together, and sometimes you use, nice sticky notes. You draw, there's a style of arrow that you draw to kind of like draw the musician's eye so that they can make the cut seamlessly. And I will say, like, having done the Pops Librarian cycle a couple of times, there is nothing so anxiety-inducing as like the first time that an orchestra in rehearsal with a major conductor who expects their cuts to have been put in ahead of time approaches a cut in that first rehearsal for the first time. I mean, like, I was standing up for every single one of these being like, does anybody look confused? It's very stressful.
Yes.
All right. Well, librarians, clearly, we love you. And we just wanted to dedicate this segment. So listeners, if you have any questions about library stuff, maybe we get a librarian on the show at some point, or not.
I think that we have some librarians among our listeners. So yeah, big shout out.
Yeah, come on our show. All right. Moving on to our third topic. Tiffany.
Jan Swafford is a composer and writer who has written extensive and well-respected musical biographies of Charles Ives, Johannes Brahms, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He has written columns on music for Slate, is heard as a commentator on NPR and the BBC, and he regularly annotates programs for institutions like the Boston Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, Chicago Symphony, San Francisco Symphony, Met Opera, and Carnegie Hall. He has taught at schools including Boston University, Amherst College, Tufts, and Boston Conservatory. Swafford's biography of Mozart is entitled Mozart, The Reign of Love, and while it came out back at the end of 2020, we've taken the opportunity of the release of the softcover edition to invite him to chat with us here on the Gabfest about the work. So welcome to the podcast, Jan, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Let's dive right in. So tell us about the title, I think, is where we might start for our listeners.
It started with what was basically the climax of the book, which is the opera, The Magic Flute. It's Zauberflöte. I've always felt that opera was kind of an allegory of love, that it was the earthly love of Papageno for Papageno, the kind of exalted love of Pamina and Tamino, and the divine love of Sarastro. So what I'd originally seen as the climax of the book, and that opera kind of flowed backward through the rest of the book, and I realized that was in effect a theme. So I asked my Facebook friends what they thought of that subtitle, and they said they didn't much like it. And we all tried to think of something else and couldn't.
Well, it is quite the catchy title, and quite honestly, when you want to rope people in, so it makes sense to me.
I hope so, but it's also, again, it's absolutely apropos to Mozart's work and his life. He was, as far as we know, a happily married man. I mean, imagine that for a famous artist.
Well, it seems as if one of the through lines in your writing is that some of the common conceptions that we have about Mozart are not, in fact, that accurate. So why don't you take us into a little bit about what these conceptions you sought to correct here?
Most of them I didn't personally correct because they've been corrected over the last quarter century or so. And these were all myths that grew up in the 19th century. Basically, their idea was if you're an artist, you have to suffer. That's one thing. And you have to be misunderstood. And you have to be poor and neglected and starving and buried in a pauper's grave and all that kind of stuff. And it was a matter of taking the life of Mozart, which was after his incredible, prodigy childhood, was really not all that eventful. He had his problems like the rest of us. He had his troubles with dad. He had losses and disappointments, but really nothing all that terrible. And he mostly just spent his life doing what he wanted to do, the way he wanted to do it. And basically, the 19th century ginned up his life into a grand Beethovenian tragedy because Beethoven had become the pattern of what it means to be, in many ways, an artist itself. I mean, the romantic cult of genius is the divine, suffering, semi-divine genius is based on Beethoven, and Mozart had to be shoehorned into that pattern, but it's just not true. What can you say? It ain't so.
So, Jan, I've read your biographies of Brahms and Beethoven, and now I'm about, 200 pages into this new brick that you've unleashed on the world. And it's fantastic. I really love your writing. I'm so curious to know about your research process. You must have spent really significant chunks of time in Austria and Germany over the last 15 years researching these guys. Can you just talk about how you go about putting together a book like this?
Well, years ago, I had a Fulbright to Vienna when I was working in the Brahms. So I got to be pretty intimate with Vienna. I spent a lot of that time just walking around the city and looking at stuff. And I almost got a visceral feel for the city in my bones. A lot of the buildings are still there. I mean, they're old buildings. Beethoven and Mozart would both be able to make their way around Vienna to a large degree today. For the Mozart, I did a sort of grand tour of Mozartian cities, Prague, where Don Giovanni was premiered, and Salzburg, where he grew up, and back to Vienna. And his house, what's called the Figaro House, where he wrote Figaro, is still there. I'd seen it before, but I went back, and it's kind of incredible to be standing in a room where you know that Haydn told Mozart's dad, after they read through some string quartets that Mozart dedicated to Haydn, and Haydn said to Leopold Mozart, "Your son is the greatest composer I've ever known or heard of." You're standing in that room. That's kind of incredible, really.
I'm reading the part of the book where you're looking at Mozart's earliest compositions, like into his teenage years. And you note that when looking at the manuscripts, you see the little emendations of Papa Mozart, of Leopold, making little corrections here and there. And so, I mean, did you have your hands on the manuscripts? And what's it like to see these manuscripts? And what sort of things do you see Leopold marking, in the margins or correcting?
I did have in my hands the manuscript of Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, which was just boggling. And what I saw there was something that, again, I already knew from research. You can tell how he put pieces together to a large extent. He would write through, say, an aria or an ensemble, and he would write the vocal part and the bass line, and then bits and pieces of things, accompaniments and things as they struck him. And then he would go back and fill in the rest. So it was kind of a 2 or 3 layered process. And you can tell by the different colors of the inks. What it means is, I see as a composer, is that first, well, there are 2 reasons he did it that way. First is he wanted to get the continuity without worrying about all the details. He wanted to have the piece mapped out from beginning to end, and the tune and the bass line there. Those are the kind of foundations of the whole thing. And then you would go back. But also, if you're writing an opera, you write the tune and the bass line, which a keyboard player can fill in the harmony from that point. And that's what you give the singers to learn their parts, because you've got to give it to them as soon as you can, because they've got to memorize them. One of the myths about Mozart is that he was so divinely inspired that he just wrote it out in one go and it was perfect. But the reality is that he made sketches, probably not nearly as much as Beethoven did. But basically he did, and his wife essentially threw him away. Whereas Beethoven kept every scrap of paper he ever put a pen to.
You write about, in your prologue, about the fact that you are a composer yourself, writing about composers, and that kind of gives you a unique voice in writing these biographies from the aspect of a composer rather than, let's say, a historian or a musicologist. Can you speak to that a little bit and show us a little bit what you mean by that through the works of Mozart?
Well, I don't mean that this gives me superior insight. I just mean it gives me a different kind of insight. And I look at my experience as a composer, writing about composers, is sort of what I bring to the table as a biographer. And I look at what I do as complementary to what theorists and regular musicologists do. But first of all, I look at a piece of music as something written note by note. I see somebody sitting there writing. And that is a different thing than looking at a piece of music as a kind of finished Talmudic object. I look at it as a sort of object in process, which is mutable. It is not a Talmudic object. It's something that was written in a particular time and place and sometimes rethought later, because Mozart did write revisions. I mean, I'll give you an example that really struck me. I saw years ago an exhibition of Marriage of Figaro, and there was the famous aria, Little Count, dum bum bum ba da dum bum 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 ba da, with a melody that seems absolutely unnatural, like it wrote itself. And then you look at the page, and he changed one note in the melody. And to do that, he had to take a knife and scrape out the note on the page all the way down a complete orchestra score about 15 times to change that one note to a note that seems absolutely inevitable, but it wasn't the original note. And then he had to do it again in the reprise later, and it's a lot of trouble to change notes in a manuscript. And the other thing is, I see a piece, in the case of Beethoven, for example, we have a lot of sketches of Beethoven, and there's some classic studies of the sketches. And my question as a composer was, when he's sketching a piece, working on it, what did he know and when did he know it? At what point was Beethoven just following through an idea that struck him that seemed interesting? And at what point was he thinking about the totality of a piece and sketching in a particular direction with a concept behind it? And what I saw in the sketches was that very early on, he knew where he was headed. He just didn't know quite how to get there. And I wrote a whole chapter on the Eroica, the Third Symphony. And looking at this, what are called the continuity sketches in one line, for one thing, people tend to think that he was just thinking in one line. He wasn't. He was writing out in one line as a memory aid what he was hearing in his head as a complete orchestra, with the melody and the harmony and the bass and everything else. And I was looking at sketches he wrote for the exposition, the first part of the first movement. And what I saw was that what I saw as the finished thing that was like a very exploratory, searching exposition, almost as if it's development section. That was the conception from the beginning. He was already doing sketches that way. He just didn't know how to put it together yet. With Mozart, we don't have a lot of the sketches, so you can't say that as much. But what I can see in Mozart, he didn't develop as widely as Beethoven did, but then nobody else did. And besides, he lived about 20 years less. But I was able to see certain changes in his focus of how he put pieces together. Let's put it that way. I know how pieces start. They start as this kind of itch in your head or an idea, and the idea starts to, you begin to think, yeah, okay. Oh, what does this imply?
I love the way that you describe, the way we often approach works from the user end, which is looking at things as if they were inevitable. Talmudic was the word that you used, and unsettling that expectation a lot. Is there a sort of parallel to that in the way that you approach writing about their lives? Because we view these people as giants of mankind, but of course in their own time they were just humans too. The introduction talks about Mozart's rambunctious sense of humor and the way that he would go catapulting over. There's a sort of humanizing that goes on with the actual man himself as well, right?
Yeah, I write about people as if I want to create a sense in the reader that this person is a friend of yours. You don't know everything about them, and we don't know everything about ourselves. And that it happens by an accumulation of details, an accumulation of anecdotes and details. And you have to have a certain eye for those what tells you something. Most people look at a biography as an interpretation of a person. I don't look at it that way. I don't think people live their lives to be interpreted by somebody else for their own benefit. I try not to interpret. I only say something interpretive if it seems to me quite obvious. In the case of Brahms, a lot of what looks like interpretation was just following his own lead because he understood himself very well. I had somebody who panned my Brahms book because it said I had it in for Bruckner. Brahms didn't like Bruckner. All I did was reported that. And nothing to do with me. I'm something of a Bruckner fan. Yeah. But this person assumed that if there were things against Bruckner in the book, that even though they're quotes from Brahms, that's because I didn't like Bruckner. It's nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I imagine that, it's all very well and good to say, okay, well, I'm just reporting facts, but I imagine that there must be a sort of filtering on your end of like what facts are interesting enough to merit writing a biography about. And are there any anecdotes about, details about Mozart's life, do you think that, galvanized you to write a biography about Mozart to give this kind of humanizing window in? Do you remember any of those?
I begin a book by just typing out a simple chronology. And with people like Mozart, there's always a published chronology. And then the next thing I do is type up letters, hundreds of pages of letters. And when you've done that, you learn how somebody talks, and you learn to a degree how they think.
Yeah.
And things that may seem strange or obscure become clear. I learned that Brahms was a tremendous ironist. Brahms himself said, I only write half sentences. The reader has to supply the other half. And I felt that nobody had knew how to supply the other half. With Mozart, I quickly realized, and I think people have said this, that Mozart was a man of the theater. But I also realized it was beyond that. He was a theatrical person. He had the personality of an actor and this ability to give himself to whatever part he was playing at the moment as a human being or as a composer, because he was Sarastro and he was Tamino and he was Papageno. And I realized typing up the letters that with every person he wrote to, he had a particular voice with that person that did not change. Now, we all do that to a degree. We don't write mom and dad the same way we write our friends. But he was so extreme and consistent in that. And all the really raunchy letters were written to one person, a cousin that he was fooling around with. And his letters to dad after a certain point are absolutely consistent. They're rather dry. Letters to his friends in later life can be quite funny, but they're calm, So I just realized how consistent he was, that every part he played, even when he was begging for money later in life, was consistent. He always wrote this person the same way, and that tells you something about him. So a lot of the time with Mozart, I use the analogy of an actor. Mozart was acting his librettos as an opera composer. He was very picky about libretto, but once he picked something, he didn't change the story. He changed the musical structure of the libretto. And I felt a lot of people tended to write about him as if he wrote the librettos. It's not true. And I began to use the analogy of an actor. An actor in playing Shakespeare's Iago does not like Iago. Iago is a terribly evil person, but it's his job to put Iago over. And Mozart's job was to put over his librettos and the characters and so forth. And he took them as he got them and shaped the librettos only in terms of, where do we want the climaxes? And, we don't need an aria here. We want an aria over there and that kind of thing.
So, Jan, I'm curious a little bit about the metatextual reading of you as a biographer of composers. You started with Ives, then you did Brahms, Beethoven, Mozart. You sort of worked backwards through music history. And I was just curious to know if there was any reason why. Was it that, when you were researching Brahms, did you find so much material about his relationship with Beethoven? And did that get you involved in the details of Beethoven? And then you thought, well, now I've got to write the Beethoven biography. I could see the same thing happening from Beethoven to Mozart. But just tell us a little bit about that progression, maybe.
You're right. I'm going backward in history, but I'm specifically going backward in Viennese history. And one of my things I realized working with Brahms and Vienna in that period of the later 19th century, there's nothing more interesting historically than Vienna. It's always an incredibly interesting place. So going back from, in effect, Brahms died really of the fin de siècle, and the cultural disaster of Vienna and Germanic countries was beginning to happen. I mean, Brahms saw it coming. He said in 1884, this culture is heading for catastrophe. And he knew anti-Semitism had a lot to do with it. So Brahms sort of overlapped into the modernism almost. The day Brahms died was the day the secession artists seceded from the standard artistic organization in Vienna, people like Klimt and eventually Schiele. With Vienna in the time of Mozart, there was a writer named Petzel who wrote this marvelous stuff about Vienna that just had everything from, what they were eating to what the social classes were like and what they were wearing and who was sleeping with who. And it was a marvelous resource for the texture of life in the city. And he's where I got things like the dust, this awful dust that was the compound of dry streets and the leavings of cows and horses, thousands of them. It was just everywhere and awful. I think maybe Petzel quoted a British traveler who said every street in Vienna has its own smell and they're all bad.
Well, I'm assuming that you are at the feeling at the moment that you don't want to ever write another book again. But if you were to do one, what do you think would be next for you?
I just did a pitch for a biography of William Faulkner.
Oh, real left turn here. Interesting.
Well, and part of the pitch was why I'm not a writer about music. I'm a writer, period. Mm-hmm. But I've been reading Faulkner for about 55 years. I got interested in him in my late teens, and sometimes actually studying him and rereading him. And I just think he's an extraordinary person and troubling in many ways and miraculous in some ways. And I think he's our Homer.
Thanks so much for being with us today to discuss your work in general and especially this book, which I recommend to our listeners to pick up. Before you go, Jan, would you mind sticking around and recommending something for our classical mixtape?
I'd be glad to.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Jan, what would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, what I'm going to share is a piece that I play to nearly everybody I know. If you know me, you eventually hear this piece because it's one of the most moving, beautiful things in the world, and it's by a composer who's very little known named Giacomo Carissimi. It's the last chorus from his oratorio Jephthe called Plorate, filii Israel. And the situation is that in the Bible, Jephthe, who's this teenage girl, I think her father has told God that if he wins this battle, he will sacrifice the first person he sees in gratitude. And these kind of promises to God don't tend to turn out well. And of course, it turns out to be his beloved daughter. And in this case, God doesn't come down from heaven and send an angel and save her. She's going to get killed. So the last chorus is the lamentation of her friends. Most of it is just the word lamentamini, let us lament. And I was looking at it on YouTube I was looking at some of the comments, and some people said that they sang this in a choir and they couldn't get through it without tears. It's that good and so strange. It has these extraordinary harmonies that are unlike anything you've ever heard.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that recommendation, Jan, and thanks once again for being on the GabFest today.
Been a delight. Thank you.
Kensho, what do you have for us this week?
All right, so this is a totally random thing not associated with our episode, but I've always loved cello ensembles of any sort. Of course, the 12 Berlin cellist ensemble and stuff, I eat that stuff up. So this is not 12, but 4 cellos playing Paul Wiancko's cello quartet opus 1 titled When the Night.
Wow, Paul Wiancko is one of those names that I've heard. I've never heard anything that he wrote, and apparently this is his opus 1. How interesting. That's beautiful.
I love his music. It's all like string quartet or like chamber music ensemble, small ensemble stuff, but really great.
Wow, thanks, Kensho. All right, Tiffany, what do you have this week?
I ran across this piece when doing a programming exercise this week, so this is Ellen Taaffe Zwilich, Jubilation. This is one of those people that, again, like you had just described, people whose names that you like know but had never heard the music of. Mm-hmm. I never actually sat down and listened to any of Zwilich's music until this past week. So this is kind of fun. I mean, she has a couple different languages that are going on. This is part of a phase of her career that I think she calls like post-romantic or neo-romantic, something like that. So,
well, it's interesting. I mean, it's called Jubilation, but I mean, from what we just heard, clearly it's not an unalloyed jubilation. I mean, this is a jubilation with undertones.
Yeah, so she has another piece called Celebration as well. And like my impression of the names of these couple pieces, and maybe a couple more in her catalog as well, is that like, so Jubilation was commissioned for the opening of a performing arts center at University of Georgia, and like I think then the piece got named before it got composed, if you know what I mean. Like that's my feeling anyway. But it's a fun piece.
Well, thanks so much for that mixtape recommendation, Tiffany. All right, so for my recommendation this week, I thought, well, we've got to have Mozart. And I've been reading Jan's biography of Mozart. It always takes me a long time to read his biographies of these composers, and it's not because they're poorly written. I mean, if you just sat down and read it, I would read it like in a day, even though it's 750 pages. It takes me a while to read these books because he writes so vividly about the music itself that I want to listen through, these composers as they're developing. And the piece that I wanted to bring today is from a little-known opera of Mozart. It's called Mitridate, Re di Ponto. And the aria that I'm choosing here is called Se di lauri I crine adorno. Mozart was 14 years old when he wrote it, and it was a new experience for him. This was a commissioned opera. This was like a big break for him. And he was writing for a star in this case. And as Jan points out in the biography, in these days, if you were a new composer writing an opera for a star, if they didn't like what you wrote for them, they would just replace it with an aria by some other composer that they knew worked well, that got applause, that fit their voice really well, that was dramatic and flourished. And they could just keep asking a composer. If they didn't like the first aria, they would just say, okay, well, write me another one. They were the boss. And so apparently Mozart had to rewrite this aria 4 times. And it was the 4th time was the charm. And as Jan points out, this is really the standout number in the opera. Find the links to all these into our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.